Brenda had lunch, washed the dishes, and laid down to take a nap. Her husband had gone to their country house to help his friend fix the fence. He wouldn't be back until tomorrow evening, and on Monday, he had to go to work. Brenda had retired a year ago, while Bill still had 2 more years of work ahead of him. An unexpected phone call jolted her out of her doze. Brenda didn't immediately realize it was the phone ringing. "Hello." She answered with a hoarse voice, still half asleep, without even glancing at the screen. Who else could be calling her besides her daughter or her husband? Bill didn't like calling, so it must be her daughter. Her daughter lived with her husband in another city and was due to give birth soon. "Brenda? Were you asleep?" A strange woman's voice sounded from the receiver. "Who is this?" Brenda asked cautiously. There was a demonstratively loud sigh on the other end of the line. "Didn't recognize me? It's been so long since we last saw each other." "Tiffany." "How did you get my number?" Brenda was surprised, but for some reason, she didn't feel happy about it at all. "Is that important?" "I met your mother a few years ago. She gave it to me." Brenda remembered something her mother had said. "Are you in town?" she asked, realizing it was a foolish question. "Why call if not to arrange a meeting?" "There were rumors that you went to America," she added. Laughter echoed through the receiver, quickly turning into a groan. "What's wrong? Where are you?" Brenda asked, growing worried. "I'm in the hospital." "That's actually why I'm calling you. Can you come see me? There's something I want to tell you." "And please, don't bring anything," came the strained voice from the other end. "In the hospital? Are you sick?" Brenda asked, fully awake now. "It's hard for me to talk. I'll send you the address and a message." "What?" Brenda began, but the phone emitted short beeps. A message followed, naming the hospital. "My goodness, Tiffany has cancer." Brenda read the message in confusion. She looked at the clock. It was 5:30. By the time she got to the hospital, visiting hours would be over. She went to the kitchen and took a chicken out of the freezer for the broth. Tiffany had said not to bring anything, but how could she go to the hospital empty-handed? Homemade broth wasn't just food, it was medicine. Brenda left the chicken to thaw in the sink and sat down at the table. It had been 20 years since she last saw Tiffany. As Brenda aged, she began to approach all news cautiously, even the good ones. After Tiffany's call, she couldn't shake off the feeling of worry. And Bill's absence seemed oddly comforting. Maybe it was for the best. Tomorrow morning she would make broth, visit Tiffany, and find out everything. But she just couldn't calm down. Tiffany was raised by her paternal grandmother from the age of 10. She didn't know affection and often stayed late at Brenda's, doing homework together. Her grandmother lived on a small allowance. Tiffany's parents drank heavily. Their home was always filled with noisy crowds, often resulting in fights and quarrels. It's unclear whether someone deliberately started the fire or if, as the police believed, Tiffany's father fell asleep with a lit cigarette. Tiffany's parents couldn't escape the burning house. Her grandmother went somewhere, and as always, Tiffany was with Brenda. They survived. After the fire, Tiffany and her grandmother moved into a hostel. They barely had enough money to get by. Tiffany often ate at Brenda's. Tiffany's grandmother didn't love her mother, calling her a witch and blaming her for her son's death due to her drinking. Tiffany's mother was a beauty. Rarely did a man, regardless of age, pass her by without noticing. Her father was terribly jealous and even abusive. Tiffany grew up and outwardly became very similar to her mother. just as tall, slender, with a mass of curly red hair, black eyes, and plump lips. Freckles all over her face didn't spoil her appearance at all. On the contrary, they gave her a golden hue. Right after finishing school, Tiffany ran away from home with some guy passing through. A chip off the old block, sighed her grandmother. Brenda's mother didn't like her daughter's friendship with Tiffany, although she felt sorry for the poor girl. When she ran away from town, her mother even breathed a sigh of relief. She always feared that Tiffany would lead Brenda astray from the right path. What bound them together? Brenda herself didn't know, although she had fun with Tiffany. Brenda graduated from college, started working, met Bill, and married him. A year later, they had a daughter. She only heard rumors about Tiffany. Brenda's mother worked and couldn't help out. In the evenings, when Tiffany was at home, she felt shy about coming over. Brenda was constantly struggling by herself, often literally collapsing from exhaustion. The only thing she dreamed of at that time was getting some sleep. Every time she closed her eyes while breastfeeding her daughter, Brenda would fall asleep. She would startle awake, afraid she had dropped her daughter or that she was suffocating under the weight of her heavy breast. But the baby, having eaten her fill, slept peacefully in her arms. Brenda would then transfer her to the crib and go express milk, prepare lunch, wash soaked diapers, forcing herself not to close her eyes. During this difficult time for Brenda, Tiffany showed up. She looked even more like her mother, even more beautiful, although that was hardly possible. Well, look at you, friend. I always knew that marriage and motherhood don't suit a woman. I'll never have children, Tiffany said to Brenda, as always, without any greeting or preamble. Don't count yourself out, Brenda chuckled. Then Tiffany told Brenda that she had had many abortions and would never be able to have children. But maternal feelings are genetically ingrained in a woman. Tiffany gladly helped take care of the child, taking walks with them while Brenda, tired, prepared lunch or simply slept. Soon Tiffany left the guy she had run away with, having her first abortion because of him. Her next man was much older. He rented Tiffany an apartment in central London and visited her twice a week. It was almost like a fairy tale, Tiffany sighed, reminiscing about those days. Why almost? Brenda asked. Listening to her friend talk about men was boring and uninteresting, but she maintained the conversation out of politeness. He was old, grumpy, Tiffany grimaced. Although he wasn't stingy, he gave me a lot of money, jewelry, furs. What about his wife, children? Brenda inquired. What about them? Tiffany waved her hand dismissively. The man found out that Tiffany was seeing other men during the rest of her time and kicked her out of the apartment. Then there were others, even a foreigner. That's where the rumor started that she had gone to America. Although the foreigner was from America. Why am I always talking about myself? How did you manage to get yourself into such a mess, turning into a milk factory? And you call this happiness? I don't need that, Brenda scolded Tiffany. Bill looked at Tiffany warily. I didn't know you had such a friend, he said when he saw her for the first time. Quiet, or she'll hear you, Brenda interrupted him. She'll stay with us for a few days. She has nowhere to go, no one left. Even her grandmother passed away. She's kind, just looks tough. You know how she helps me with Dorothy? Then Dorothy developed a fever that couldn't be brought down. On the third day, they called an ambulance. They gave Dorothy an injection and took her to the hospital. Brenda rushed out of the apartment in her bathrobe and slippers. Bill was bewildered, and Tiffany brought spare clothes, shampoo, toothpaste with a brush to the hospital. A week later, they were discharged from the hospital. Brenda looked around the clean apartment. There was a pot of soup and some cutlets in a container in the fridge. Did you make all this yourself? And clean the floors? Brenda was surprised. It was Tiffany, Bill said, avoiding eye contact. And you called her a loose woman? Brenda scolded her husband. Where is she? I don't know, she left. Why are you so concerned about her? How's our daughter? Tell me, he deflected. That night Brenda cuddled up to her husband, missing him. The worry over her daughter had drained her milk. Her breasts no longer hurt, unlike before when Bill's tight embrace caused her pain at night. But Bill mumbled something incoherent and turned away from her. The same thing happened the next night. Bill, what's wrong? Have you fallen out of love with me? I was exhausted, desperately needing sleep, but I never refused your intimacy, Brenda said, hurt. He said something, trying to justify himself. But eventually, things got better for them. Brenda lost weight now. She didn't need to eat much to produce milk. Their daughter grew up and got married. Brenda and Bill lived together, just the two of them, peacefully and harmoniously, unlike their youth. And now this phone call. Brenda couldn't imagine Tiffany being terminally ill. There must be some mistake. She couldn't fall asleep at night, her mind racing with thoughts and memories. Exhausted from tossing and turning, she got up and started to make broth. Without waiting for visiting hours, she poured the broth into a thermos and headed to the hospital. She hoped to persuade the guard to let her in. In the narrow room, 2 beds lined the walls. On one of them lay a frail woman in a headscarf. Because of it, she appeared old to Brenda. She wanted to ask if she had entered the right room, but the woman opened her eyes and asked, Brenda, do you recognize me? How she had changed. Her face was small, pale, and drawn. Even her freckles had disappeared. Then, twig-like arms lay on top of the covers. Where had the vibrant Tiffany gone? Her black eyes had dimmed. Clearly, Brenda's face reflected a whirlwind of emotions. I didn't recognize you, Brenda said. She tried to compose herself, smiled, and approached the bed. What's wrong with you? I got what you deserved. Sit down. Tiffany gestured to the edge of the bed. Brenda sat down. She remembered the broth, started hurriedly taking out the thermos. Put it away. I won't have any, Tiffany said, her gaze fixed anxiously on Brenda. I'll put it on the bedside table. It's fresh, just made. Maybe you'll eat it later. Tiffany didn't reply. How are you feeling? Brenda asked, unsure of what to say to avoid causing offense. For the final stage, I'm fine. Are you going to have surgery? It's too late. Let's not waste time. My strength won't last long. I wanted to tell you. What? Don't interrupt. Tiffany cut her off and coughed. I always envied you, she said, catching her breath after the strained cough. The apartment, the good husband, the daughter, parents alive. Even when you fell asleep from exhaustion sitting down, I envied you. Tiffany fell silent. There were so many men, so much money, but I was never happy for a minute. Although, no, I was. Remember when you and your daughter ended up in the hospital? Of course. You brought me clothes then, Brenda smiled. I thought I would take my secret to the grave. But now I'm so scared. You were in the hospital, and I stayed with Bill. Tiffany's voice grew quieter. She often paused, struggling with shortness of breath, looking barely alive. Brenda understood everything then. She just didn't want to admit it to herself. Who would it have been better for? And things quickly improved between her and Bill back then. I envied you so much that I decided to touch your happiness. Just a little bit. I seduced Bill. If I had just wanted to, he would have left you. I'm sure of it. Tiffany closed her eyes. I always remembered those few days with him. She spoke up again after a few minutes. They lasted me a lifetime. Why did you tell me now? Brenda stared out the window, unable to see Tiffany's eyes, thirsty for forgiveness. I'm dying. Tiffany lightly touched Brenda's hand, like a butterfly landing. Brenda pulled her hand away, jumped off the bed so abruptly that Tiffany's light body bounced on the stretched springs. Forgive me, Tiffany whispered. Without looking back, Brenda rushed out of the room. She decided to ruin my life in the end. She wants forgiveness. Even now, as she's dying, she still envies. I will live on. I have a husband. Soon there will be grandchildren, but there's no one left for her to come to. How many women's lives has she ruined, entangling herself with their husbands, taking money away from families and children? Before, I would have forgiven her, but now I can't. She didn't tell me for her own salvation, but to destroy my life in the end. Brenda, gasping for breath, ran down the street, not noticing the tears or what she was saying out loud. She hopes to cause a scandal between me and Bill, to make us quarrel. She's calculated everything. Brenda stopped, looked around, and walked on slower now, as if weights were tied to her feet. She saw a bench and sat down. What am I really doing? She's dying. I suspected everything back then. I felt it. I stayed silent because I was afraid to be left alone with my daughter in my arms. You left and I stayed. Whether I forgive or not, you're already punished. It's terrifying to die at such a young age. My God, what am I doing? Brenda jumped up from the bench, then sat down again. Then she stood up decisively and walked away. There was a church at the hospital gates. Brenda went in, bought candles, and wrote a note about the health of the seriously ill Tiffany. Just on April 8th will be the day of remembrance of the holy martyr Tiffany of Gothland, smiled the woman behind the candle counter. Is she your relative? The Lord is merciful, forgiving all our sins. Brenda walked home slowly. The storm inside her had calmed. When Bill returned, she fed him and told him she had been to see Tiffany at the hospital. Which Tiffany? Her husband asked. Remember when she came to us when I was in the hospital with Dorothy? She's dying. She called, asking me to come, and I took her some broth. Did Bill tense up, or was it just her imagination? He looked at her attentively, waiting for more, perhaps questions. So how about you? Did they fix the fence? Brenda changed the subject, clearing the dishes from the table. Bill sighed heavily and began to speak. Listen, what if we buy a small house outside the city? You can plant flowers in front of the windows, grow strawberries, listen to nightingales at night. We'll take the grandchildren for the summer. Get a dog. Pick mushrooms in the forest, go fishing. Bill dreamily spoke, lying next to Brenda at night. Why not? It's a wonderful idea, Brenda said, smiling. She felt light and peaceful. Why dredge up the past? So many years have passed. My husband and I are one. Who hasn't made mistakes? He didn't leave. He didn't abandon me and the child. But he could have. Could he? Probably. Well, she didn't steal my husband, and I'm grateful for that. Brenda thought, falling asleep, snuggled against Bill's warm side. 2 days later, they called her from the hospital and informed her that Tiffany had passed away. Are you a relative? Will you be arranging the funeral? They asked on the phone. No. Brenda wanted to scream, but she remained silent. She went to the hospital. arranged everything necessary for the funeral. She stood alone at the graveside. Then someone had to bid farewell to Tiffany properly. God commands forgiveness. She remembered the words of the woman from the hospital chapel. If you don't forgive, you'll harm yourself. Tiffany envied me, maybe not just me. And what became of her? I might have been 100 times worse off if I had grown up without parents, with a bitter old grandmother. Brenda thought over Tiffany's grave. Resentment also burns the soul, attracts sadness and illness. And that's it. I've forgiven. Now it's up to you and God, Brenda said, tossing a handful of soil into the grave. She walked away from the cemetery, breathing in the spring air of April. Buds were swelling on the trees. Young grass was sprouting along the paths. Bill will be home from work soon. I need to get dinner ready. Brenda saw a taxi approaching the cemetery gates and hurried towards it.